Kero Kero Bonito's Time and Place. This album follows up Bonito Generation. Now that album was just constant joy. It's pretty one note, it's pretty redundant. The shtick kind of gets played out. You know, I can enjoy it quite a lot in small doses, but I do think there is a lot of heart to that album. I think it's pretty endearing and catchy, even if it is, again, really repetitive. Time and Place takes their very sweet, delicate, and joyful power pop sound that's very sugary and nice and easygoing on the ears. It takes the style they had kind of offered with Bonito Generation and kind of twists it around a bit in a more tortured way, because on their recent release, the One True EP, they kind of introduced some elements of lo-fi pop and some industrial elements too, and there were points where it would get pretty experimental and kind of, you know, noisy, and those musical differences do appear again on Time and Place, as well as uses of very sunny, summery guitars, some pretty warm strings at points. There are some full-on punk-inspired grungy rock jams on this new album too. The sound palette is a lot more unorthodox on this album than it was on Bonito Generation, which does make for some pretty interesting surprises in the track list. But the thing I find the most interesting about this new record is gotta be the juxtaposition between the writing and the musical presentation, because we're still hearing songs that are very sweet and delicate and catchy, but the writing is deeply personal this time around. This album is really expressive, really confessional, existential at points, and the way that kind of harshly clashes with the kind of sweet, sugary presentation of the music makes for some genuinely pretty evocative moments. The lead frontwoman, Sarah Midori Perry, her singing in Kero Kero Bonito, just in general, it's very soothing, it's playful, it's kind of robotic in a sense. It's almost a little bit monotone, but it all feels like it's just very wholesome and warm. It sounds very innocent. As one note as it is, I do think it is pretty likable. I think there is a lot of heart to it. And before on Bonito Generation, she just sounded like someone who is just completely full of life and joy, and without any worries in the world imaginable. But here on Time and Place, her very playful tone now kind of sounds more like a disguise to mask the internal troubles she's constantly having to face on a daily basis. Because again, the writing displays a much more scared and confused character, you know, unsure, uncertain of where their place is in the world and who they really want to be, which gives the sweetness of their sound a much more interesting and layered context. Like, I think Time Today is a fantastic example of this, because this is a really catchy and sweet song, but beneath the surface, I think it's one of the eerier tracks on this album, as you're hearing Sarah just hopelessly questioning why her brain is stopping her from achieving what she wants to do, and she's spending all of this free time just stuck in this mental prison. Like, she's got so much time to accomplish everything she wants to do, but she just can't break free from just how down she feels. I think it's quite an interesting and pretty cathartic parallel having these really uncertain and frail subject matters be paired up against these more kind of delicate instrumentals. I think the song Make Believe is also a fantastic example of this too, as this song is sort of all about just being so defeated by the real world to the point where you only really find comfort in things that are not real. Whether it be just being in a dream state or creating new ideas through music, just the real world is nothing but an obstacle getting in the way of happiness for Sarah on this track, and I think that's really compelling. And it helps too that the song itself is just such a fucking cute jam musically. It's really pleasant, really melodic and fun. And the points that are the most genuinely chilling, I think, has got to be on the song Only Acting, as well as the very frightening and harrowingly eerie closing track Rest Stop. Only Acting toying with the idea of just her happiness only being a performance, and she doesn't actually feel that way, and she's just completely selling it, but internally she's just freaking out. And then you have the songs Flyway and Swimming, which are also two huge highlights for me. Flyway, I love the sentiment of just like looking at birds and just their freedom and just hoping that you could do that too, like just fly away from fucking everything, just constantly wishing you could just push everything aside and just live freely. I thought that was really interesting, and this instrumental, this is probably my favorite instrumental on the whole album. I fucking really wish Flyway was longer. Unfortunately though, I do think the album kind of fails to explore the full potential, the immense potential of this idea. The idea of giving us really fruitful and lovable pop songs, but pairing them up with really tortured and personal writing. I think there's a lot to explore there, but they kind of end up kind of falling into a bit of a trap in the second half of the album. I think most of the cuts in the second half are incredibly redundant and inessential. A lot of those songs just strike me as sort of lesser attempts at pulling off what previous tracks on the album had already done. If I'd known, Visiting Hours, Dear Future Self, these tracks don't really offer many ideas that were not present on previous tracks, I guess. I mean, lyrically, sure, they do have their own little concepts and whatnot, but musically and just the general goal I think they're all shooting for is kind of the same deal. Visiting Hours depicting a very bleak visit to the hospital, and then we have A Dear Future Self, which is sort of a song from the perspective of past Sarah, talking to where she think she'll be in the future. Just again, very introspective, personal, reflective writing paired up with some pretty sweet power pop jams. These tracks aren't really doing enough to set themselves apart, and I feel like as a result they feel kind of inessential and redundant and make a lot of the material on this thing, which is, I mean, it's a shame because it's such a brief album, so you really feel like you want every track to have its own distinguishable character, but they just don't pull that off. Like, yet again, with this album, I kind of feel like they carved themselves into a bit of a shtick, and it gets kind of transparent and see-through when you enter the second half of the record. Like the loose, kind of lo-fi, semi-industrial power pop sound they have going on. I just don't think it has as much variation on this album as I feel like it should do to be completely engaging from beginning to end. Like the glitzy synths and the sweet vocal melodies and the soft drums, it's all very pleasant and enjoyable and nice on the ears for sure, but it's largely unexciting to me when the tracks themselves are kind of rehashing the same ideas. Some of the songs, like Dear Future Self and Dump to an extent, failed to really present much of a massively rewarding lyrical idea. Like, sure, they do add to the very confessional approach to the writing, but I don't really think they are all that conclusive as a whole, although I do really love the guitar work on the song Dump. I also think that track makes for a really lovely cool-down moment in the track list. I think the general flow of this album is pretty decent. It can be kind of all over the place at times when you have songs like Sometimes, which is just this like acoustic jam, which is all about just like, hey, if you're feeling down, it'll be okay, just fight through it kind of thing. It feels a little bit underdeveloped, I think, that idea, and I'm not sure if I found that all that riveting, really. Some of the transitions between tracks, it kind of varies. Some of them are fantastic, some of them are a bit off, but generally I do think the flow of the album is okay. So all in all, I do really like what they're doing on this album. I think it's cool, but in this album's attempt at, you know, pushing this more wounded and transparent writing style, filled with loads of honesty and disclosure from Sarah, I think in their attempt at doing that, they kind of end up falling into a pretty transparent trap, which stops the album from feeling all that fresh by the end. Some really catchy moments and a few genuinely pretty poignant songs do keep it pretty enjoyable for me, but I would hesitate to give it any higher than a 6, personally, because I really feel like with the ideas they come up with here, they're not really reaching far enough to warrant a higher rating from me. If anything, though, I will say this is definitely a really nice step forward in regards to just musical and creative progression and just general artistic maturity for the group. You know, they've definitely broken out of just the repetitive kind of glitzy pop, fun, cutesy shtick that they had built on Bonito Generation, and into something definitely a lot more exciting and unpredictable and interesting, musically that is, on this new one. But yeah, overall, in regards to this album and how rewarded I felt and how much enjoyment I got from it, I think a 6 is the most appropriate score. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Time and Place by Kero Kero Bonito. I hope you enjoyed the review. I'll see you on the next one. Bye!